Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the KOR universe. Allow me to present to you a perspective about this Supreme Council elections intrigue, uh, Knights of Rizal crisis brought about by the pandemic, crisis because the pandemic threw a wrench to the 2018 bylaws of the Knights of Rizal. As of this reporting, the Supreme Council has voted to extend the term per the motion of the regional commanders, but it is not unthinkable that it is up for challenge. It was 4 for the extension, 2 against, and 2 were absent. It is now up to the Council of Elders to move on this recommendation if there are no challenges on the decision. I hope that this presentation would be enlighten you and put in perspective the common saying that elections have consequences. Thus, I entitled this presentation as Supreme Council, Consequential Elections, Rule of Man or Rule of Law, Part 1. Let us start with the creme de la creme of Philippine society back then. They were known as the Ilustrados. While this group of men were intellectuals, they gathered in Madrid and they took it upon themselves to organize in the propaganda movement. Members of this propaganda movement were Dr. Jose Rizal, Marcelo H. Del Pilar, and Graciano Lopez Jaina are the leaders of the propaganda movement. Reform desired by the propaganda movement were 1. Equality of the Filipinos and Spaniards before the laws. 2. Assimilation of the Philippines as a regular province of Spain. 3. Restoration of the Philippine representation in the Spanish Cortes. 4. Philippinization of the Philippine parishes and expulsions of the friars. 5. Human rights for Filipinos, such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom to meet and petition for redress of grievances. These so-called propagandists were liberal thinking. Some of them are already celebrated Filipino intellectuals known for being reformists even back then in the Philippines. Some of the members of the propaganda movement were of course Dr. Jose Rizal, Marcelo H. Del Pilar, Graciano Lopez Jaina, who were the so-called leaders, Antonio and Juan Luna, Marcelo Ponce, Pedro Paterno, Gregorio Sancianco, Jose Maria Panganiban, Antonio Maria Regidor, Isabelo de los Reyes, Miguel Moran, Anastasio Carpio. It should be known that members are not necessarily Filipino-Spanish lineage. Some are some are Spanish nationalities who have common interests with the propaganda movement. One of the upcoming personalities was Marcelo H. Del Pilar. Marcelo H. Del Pilar was already an admirer of Dr. Jose Rizal. In 1882, Del Pilar established the Diaryong Tagalog An article called Amor Patrio, written by Dr. Jose Rizal, was translated in Tagalog by Marcelo H. Del Pilar in October 28, 1888. Del Pilar escaped to Spain, and in Barcelona, he was banished by the Spanish authorities from the Philippines. He easily assimilated with the Spanish Filipino group in Barcelona. The organ of the propaganda movement was the La Solidaridad. It was published every 2 weeks and was written in Spanish, airing aspirations of the group for reforms. Marcelo H. Del Pilar, after 12 months in Barcelona, succeeded Lopez Haina as editor of the La Solidaridad. The aims of the La Solidaridad are: 1. To portray vividly the deplorable condition of the Philippines. 2. To work peacefully for the political and social reforms. 3. To combat the evil forces of medialism and reaction. 4. To advocate liberal ideas and progress. 5. To champion the legitimate aspirations of the Filipino people for democracy and happiness. Toward the closing days of 1890, there arose an unfortunate rivalry between Marcelo H. Del Pilar and Dr. Jose Rizal. Del Pilar was gaining prestige in Madrid for his vigorous editorials. Rizal, however, believed that to win respect from the Spanish people, they must possess high standards of morality, dignity, and spirit of sacrifice. Some of his former admirers turned against him and supported Del Pilar. La Solidaridad editorial policy was occasionally also contrary to Rizal's political views. 90 Filipinos in Madrid decided to patch up differences. They decided that a leader, so-called responsable, has to be chosen. It is the responsable would be: 1. Direct the affairs of the Filipinos. 2. Determine the editorial policy of the La Solidaridad. It was decided that the responsable be elected by 2/3 vote. The election took place in February 1891 between the Rizalistas and Plareristas. In 2 voting days, no one reached the 2/3 needed, although Dr. Rizal was ahead in both of the counts. The 3rd day of voting, Rizal became the responsable. But Dr. Rizal declined. He preferred to abdicate his leadership rather than cause disunity and bitterness. The consequence? Rizal retired from the propaganda movement, owing to the intrigues of his jealous compatriots. He finished the Philly in Biarritz and stopped altogether writing articles for the La Solidaridad. In August, 6 months later, Del Pilar wrote to Rizal begging for forgiveness. Rizal's response, quote, "I'm extremely surprised at your letter. I believe it is useless to talk about what does not exist, and if it has existed, it ought to have evaporated in the past. It is better to leave you alone to direct the policy. I do not meddle with it. I am like an army corps who, at a needed moment, you will see arrive." Something that never happened. In fact, in December 31, 1891, in a letter to Blumentritt, and again, quote, "I believe the La Solidaridad is no longer our battlefield. Now it is a new struggle. The fight is no longer in Madrid. I am going home to lead the reform movement." Now, what happened to Del Pilar? According to Professor Bernie Caraganilla of the UP Manila, Del Pilar outlived his significance, pushing for reform when the Katipunan was headed to another direction. Added to that was that the benefactors from the Philippines funding the La Solidaridad was thinning low. Eventually, Del Pilar died in a public hospital in Barcelona, alone and a pauper. And with that also, the La Solidaridad died. The IHQ of the Knights of Rizal is not without controversies. Just like the propaganda movement, disagreements are normal, but the recent developments in the IHQ seem to point to a strife in this international organization. Issues that might point to a direction in the next Supreme Council elections. In March, a few days ago, while there was a looming questions about Supreme Council elections, the Executive Director, Gilbert San Diego, tendered his irrevocable resignation as Executive Director, which is very unfortunate if the election was going to be held, being that Sir Gilbert was very instrumental in the IHQ. Added to this, during the International Assembly, there was supposed to be a report on the ongoing case regarding Knights of Rizal versus Maureen Fernandez et al. And Maureen Fernandez used to be the office manager in the IHQ. The ongoing case, Fernandez et al. Was charged with qualified theft. Qualified theft is the stealing of value that is qualified. Theft is over 4,200,000 pesos. The prescribed penalty is maximum period of reclusion temporal, and its medium and maximum periods, which has a range of 18 years, 2 months, and 21 days to 20 years, an incremental penalty of 2 years or more. As of this lecture, the case had to be refiled due to technicalities without prejudice. So at this ends the first part of this presentation. In the second part, we will dwell on the comparisons of the 1891 elections of the propaganda movement with that of the upcoming Supreme Council elections. Again, elections have consequences. The 1891 elections led the way for the death of the Katipunan Supremo. More on that on part 2. Thank you very much for listening, and Nanom Nis Mariar.